During the Crimean War, the groundbreaking work of the pioneering British nurse and social reformer Florence Nightingale transformed healthcare and elevated nursing to a revered profession. She demonstrated the power of evidence-based medicine by instituting stringent sanitary practices and organizing efficient care systems in military hospitals, leading to a dramatic reduction in mortality rates despite the dire conditions. Nightingale revolutionized military medicine and set the stage for contemporary public health practices with her use of statistics to assess and enhance hospital conditions. This unfaltering resolve, partnered with her empathy and reform-mindedness, have made her an everlasting symbol of care and scientific investigation, inspiring healthcare workers globally ever since. And here we are, to talk about Florence Nightingale today. Not a requested video, but I want to do it, so I'm doing it anyway. Relax and get comfortable, and if you want to, like and subscribe. But most importantly, let's learn something. Now, in case you weren't immediately aware of it, Florence Nightingale was named for the city in which she was born, and being Florence in Tuscany, Italy, she was born there in the Villa Colombaia on the 12th of May 1820 into a wealthy and influential British family. Somewhat continuing with tradition, Frances Parthenope, Florence's older sister, was also named after her birthplace, which was a Greek settlement by the name of Parthenope in part of what is now Naples. Nightingale was raised in the family's homes in Lea Hurst, Derbyshire, and Embley, Hampshire, after they returned to England in 1821, so certainly not staying for too long in Italy at all. But either way, both sides of Florence's family from a very early age instilled her in this liberal humanitarian perspective, bringing her up somewhat against the trends of the time. Her parents were Frances Nightingale and William Edward Nightingale, who was actually born William Edward Shaw. The reason for this is because, according to the terms of the forebearer Peter Nightingale's will, William inherited his estate at Lea Hurst and took the name and coat of arms of the Nightingale family. Florence's maternal grandfather, Frances's father, was William Smith, who was a well-known Unitarian and abolitionist. Nightingale was also educated by her father from a very early age. And these progressive views that the father had on women's education were of course advantageous to Florence herself and her older sister, Parthenope. They studied philosophy, history, mathematics, Italian, and of course classical literature. Florence, the more intelligent of the two girls, showed an exceptional aptitude for gathering and analyzing information at a young age, which of course she would later use to a great advantage. And so during this time, she eventually became close to one Mary Clark, a Parisian hostess of English descent, when her father took the family on a tour of Europe in 1838. She wrote that Clark was an interesting hostess who didn't mind how she looked, and that even though her opinions didn't always coincide with those of her guests, she was incapable of boring anyone. Certainly sounds like a character. She had little regard for upper-class British women, whom she considered to be generally unimportant, and her behavior was described as frustrating and eccentric. She declared that we should prefer our freedom over the galleys of being a woman if given the option. She mostly avoided female companions and hung out with the male thinkers of the time. But in the instance of Florence, and the Nightingales in particular, Clark had made an exception to that rule. Despite being 27 years apart in age, she and Florence were to stay close friends for 40 years. Now another interesting one. Florence had not learned this from her mother, but Clark showed that women could be on equal footing with men, and that was another new idea. So while at Embley Park in February 1837, Nightingale would experience the first of what she would later consider to be her multiple divine summonses, which led her to feel a deep desire to dedicate her life to helping others. When she was younger, she was considerate of her family's disapproval of her choosing to become a nurse. She didn't make the decision public until 1844. She refused to become a wife and mother, which was of course the expected role for a woman of her status. There's only so far that the liberal-minded ideas of the 1830s and 40s will get you. In spite of course, her mother and sister's rage and distress, she had to make her own decisions. Despite resistance from her family and the constrictive social code for the young, wealthy English upper-class women, Nightingale just shrugged it off and decided to put all of her education into the art and science of nursing. She characterized herself as a young woman who was graceful, and reportedly everyone who had came across her had agreed, saying that she was indeed slender, attractive, and just very pleasant to be around. She was described as being very charming, carrying a radiant smile wherever she went, despite her frequently severe demeanor when things had to be taken seriously. The politician and poet Richard Monckton Milnes was her most persistent suitor, but she turned him down after 9 years of courtship. Her reason for this was nothing personal. She just believed that her calling was nursing, and that getting married, having children, would simply get in the way of that. So very bad luck for Mr. Milnes. She also met Sidney Herbert, a politician who had served as Secretary of War from 1845 to 46, while he was on his honeymoon in Rome 1847, and he and Nightingale became close friends for life, rumours notwithstanding. During the Crimean War, Herbert and his spouse would play a crucial role in supporting Nightingale's nursing efforts in Crimea, earning him another term as Secretary of War, and she even became one of Herbert's most important advisors during this political career. Of course, some had believed that the pressure a reform program put on Herbert accelerated his death from Bright's disease in 1861. In addition, Nightingale had a close relationship with Benjamin Jowett, a scholar who might have desired to wed her. But once again, rumours notwithstanding. Nightingale went on to visit Greece and Egypt, now accompanied by Charles and Selina Bracebridge. She named the young owl Athena after she saved it from a group of children torturing it while she was in Athens, Greece, which is the exact opposite of what you think that Athenian children would be doing. Of course, the owl, if you remember from the numismatic studies I'm sure you've taken part in, was the old symbol of Athens. You can find it on all the old coins. So, Nightingale had frequently kept the owl until it passed away, just before she departed for Crimea. Interesting little aside there. And then we have her writings about Egypt in particular, that bear quite witness to her education, literary prowess, and even her outlook on life. I'll quote from the diary. Sublime in the highest style of intellectual beauty, intellect without effort, without suffering, not a feature is correct, but the whole of the effect is more expressive of spiritual grandeur than anything I could have imagined, is what she wrote of the Abu Simbel temples in January of 1850 after sailing up the Nile as far as Abu Simbel. Now, when we say up the Nile, remember that is going south. The upper Nile is the south part, and the lower Nile is actually up near Alexandria in that Nile Delta where it empties into the Mediterranean. In contrast to her much longer letters, which her older sister Parthenope was to print after her return, she wrote in her diary a week later near Cairo that she was, quote, called to God, and went on to write, God called me in the morning and asked me, would I do good for him alone without reputation? She thus went to the Lutheran church in Kaiserwerth am Rhein, Germany, later in 1850, where she saw Pastor Theodor Fleidner and the deaconesses tending to the sick and impoverished. Her first published work, The Institution of Kaiserswerth on the Rhine for the Practical Training of Deaconesses, etc., was published in 1851, albeit published anonymously. She considered this whole experience a great turning point in her life. The Institute also provided her with 4 months of medical training, which served as the foundation for her subsequent treatment. And so, moving on from Germany, she began working as the superintendent of the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in Upper Hartley Street, London, on August 22nd, 1853. And she remained doing so until October of 1854. Of course, she was able to live quite comfortably and pursue her career because her father had given her an annual income of £500 of the day's money, which is about almost $70,000 in US currency in 2025 terms. Florence's most well-known contribution, of course, occurred during the Crimean War, which all of this medical training and experience was leading up to. When the Crimean War had broken out, that was really her time to shine. It became her primary focus after news reached Britain of the appalling conditions for the injured at the military hospitals at Scutari, which is near present-day Üsküdar in Istanbul, on the Asiatic side of the Bosphorus, across from Constantinople. Britain and France joined the Ottoman Empire in the war against Russia. She was sent to the Ottoman Empire on October 21st, 1854, with the consent of Sidney Herbert, along with the staff of 38 female volunteer nurses, including her head nurse Eliza Robert, her aunt Mai Smith, and 15 Catholic nuns who had been mobilized by Henry Edward Manning. On the way, Nightingale's friend Mary Clark helped her in Paris. Across the Black Sea, at Baklava in the Crimea, the volunteer nurses worked approximately 295 nautical miles from the British camp. Early in November of 1854, Nightingale arrived at the Semelier barracks in Scutari. Her team had discovered that, despite official indifference, overworked medical personnel were providing subpar care for injured soldiers, which is certainly not really going against the grain for 1854, but you have to give them something. Mass infections, many of which were fatal, were prevalent. Hygiene was also being neglected, and as for the medications, well, good luck getting anything in that regard. And that was not all. Everybody was quite hungry. Preparing meals for the patients was extremely difficult as there was no real equipment to do so, no field kitchens, no real tools to accomplish that kind of a job, especially on the scale that was required. It was a complete mess. A bloody mess. Following Nightingale's appeal to the Times, the British government hired Isambard Kingdom Brunei to create a prefabricated hospital that could be transported to the Dardanelles from England as a government solution to the facility's poor state. As a result, Edmund Alexander Parks oversaw the Renkioi Hospital, a civilian establishment with a death rate less than a tenth of Scutari's, certainly an improvement in no uncertain terms. Nightingale either called for the Sanitary Commission or improved her own hygiene to lower the death rate from 42% to 2%. For instance, she had instituted hand washing in the hospital where she was employed, which was, of course, another new idea. Germ theory not quite caught up exactly where it was yet. There was certain concepts that were in their infancy back then, but things had a little while to catch up. Perhaps a video on the history of germ theory and medicine in the 1700s and 1800s coming up soon. Now, as for the first winter that Nightingale was at Scutari, a total of 4,077 soldiers lost their lives. This was because of diseases like cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and typhus. It killed 10 times as many soldiers as the enemy could ever hope to inflict. These wounds sustained in combat, well, they were only half of the problem, or really a fraction. Nearly 6 months after Nightingale's arrival, though, in March 1855, the British government had to dispatch the Sanitary Commission to Scutari due to overcrowding, faulty sewers, and inadequate ventilation. The Commission enhanced ventilation and cleaned the sewers out the best they could. Although the death rate was significantly decreased, Florence never took any credit for this. Nightingale was cared for by the head nurse Eliza Roberts during her own severe illness in May 1855. I'm sure she was advising her on the proper steps, no doubt. She continued to think that the soldiers' overwork, stale air, inadequate nutrition, and lack of supplies were to blame for these high death rates. Certainly not blaming it on one, but rather a combination of everything. She became convinced that the majority of the hospital soldiers, however, were killed by substandard living conditions after she returned to Britain and started gathering evidence for the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army. Her later work, in which she promoted the importance of hygienic living conditions, was impacted by this experience. As a result, she decreased army death during peacetime and focused on introducing sanitation in working-class homes and designing hygienic hospitals later on. Now, we do have some sources that claim that Nightingale and Mary Seacole, a fellow nurse who operated a hotel/hospital for the officers, had a rather chilly relationship, to say the least. Seacole's memoir, entitled Wonderful Adventures of Miss Seacole in Many Lands, what a great title, mentions only one cordial encounter in which she asked for and received a bed for the night while traveling to Scutari to join her business partners and launch their venture in Crimea. However, Seacole noted that one of the Nightingale's colleagues rejected her when she attempted to join her group, and Seacole deduced that racism was the cause of that rejection. In a private letter, Nightingale expressed her concern to her brother-in-law about potential conflicts between her job and Seacole's company, saying that although she was very kind to the men, and what is more, the officers, and did have some good, she made many drunk. According to Nightingale, I had the greatest difficulty in repelling Miss Seacole's advances and in preventing association between her and my nurses. Absolutely out of the question. Anyone who employs Miss Seacole will introduce much kindness, but also much drunkenness and improper conduct. However, Seacole had informed Alexis Soyer, a French chef at the time, that, Monsieur Soyer, you must be aware that Miss Nightingale has a great affection for me. Who knows if she was being sarcastic? She went on to say that she had graciously provided with board and lodging while she passed through Scutari, but who really knows? Perhaps she was just trying to write as diplomatically as possible. Of course, Nightingale had differing reactions when two waves of the Irish nuns, the Sisters of Mercy, who came to Scutari to help with nursing duties. Leading the first wave, Mary Clare Moore subordinated herself and her sisters to the Nightingale. For the rest of their lives, the two would be good friends. Mary Frances Bridgman led the second wave, which was less well received, because Bridgman had a deep distrust of Nightingale. You see, she saw her as ambitious, and she refused to cede full control of her sisters to her. And now on to a few little nicknames that we have. We have two of them. One of them is the Lady of the Lamp. The other is the Lady of the Hammer, which is a little bit cooler. So, during the Crimean conflict, she earned this name, the Lady of the Lamp, from a phrase that was actually reported in the Times back in London. Now we'll read from that now. She is a ministering angel, without any exaggeration in these hospitals, and as her slender form glides quietly along each corridor, every poor fellow's face softens with gratitude at the sight of her. When all the medical officers have retired for the night, and silence and darkness has settled down upon those miles of the prostrate sick, she may be observed alone with a little lamp in her hand, making her solitary rounds. And then we have another poem from Longfellow, 1857 work, Santa Filomena. Goes like this. Lo, in that house of misery, a lady with a lamp I see pass through the glimmering gloom, and flit from room to room. Thank you very much, Mr. Longfellow. And then, of course, we have the slightly cooler name of the Lady with the Hammer. Now, this all came from an incident where, after breaking into a locked storage cabinet with a hammer to obtain medication to treat the injured, she had earned this name from the soldiers. There are some of those, on the other hand, who thought the behavior was unladylike and came up with the Lady with the Lamp as a better name for her. But I think the soldiers would have appreciated the sight of her smashing the absolute you-know-what out of this cupboard. Well, to get all that medicine out, someone had to open it. There's many ways to open a cabinet. Smashing it open with a hammer is just one of them. I can only imagine just the uniformed nurses watching in horror as she did this, but this is fantastic. Now, moving on November 29, 1855, a public meeting in the Crimea recognized Nightingale for her wartime efforts, and they decided to establish the Nightingale Fund for Nursing Education. Generous donations came pouring in. The Duke of Cambridge was chairman of the fund, and Sidney Herbert was the honorary secretary. In her letters from 1856, she described Ottoman spas, including the physical characteristics, nutritional information, and other important details of the patients she sent there. The cost of treatment was much lower than in Switzerland, she said. Well, nothing's changed there. On July 9, 1860, Nightingale established her first nursing school, called the Nightingale Training School. This was at St. Thomas's Hospital, and they had £45,000 from the Nightingale Fund to do so. On May 16, 1865, the first Nightingale nurses with training started working at the Liverpool Workhouse Infirmary. The school is now part of King's College London and is known as Florence Nightingale Facility for Nursing and Midwifery. The Royal Buckinghamshire Hospital in Aylesbury, close to her sister's house, Claydon House, was dubbed an excellent model to follow, in the 1868 Most Beautiful Hospital in England in 1866. Not bad titles at all. But going back a little bit, in 1859, she penned notes on nursing, and quite detailed ones. Despite being written especially for the education of those nursing at home, the book was a mainstay of the curricula at the Nightingale School and other nursing schools. She wrote, "Every day, sanitary knowledge, or the knowledge of nursing, in other words, of how to put the constitution in such a state is that it will have no disease or that it can recover from disease, takes a higher place. It is recognized as the knowledge which everyone ought to have, distinct from medical knowledge which only a profession can have." Notes on Nursing is regarded as a classic introduction to nursing that did quite well with the reading public. Of course, for the remainder of her life, Nightingale worked to organize and advance more works on the nursing profession. But one of her major accomplishments was bringing qualified nurses into Britain's workhouses starting in the 1860s, and that was certainly a place where they needed qualified workers. This meant that nursing staff with the necessary training were now caring for sick paupers instead of other physically fit ones. The majority of the nurses in the first half of the 1800s were widows or former servants, by the way, who were compelled to work because they had simply no other means of supporting themselves. In his 1843-44 novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, Charles Dickens satirized the standard of care by portraying Sarah Gamp as inept, careless, dishonest, and even drunk all the time. According to Carolyn Worthingham, the director of the Florence Nightingale Museum, when she, Nightingale, started out, there was no such thing as nursing. The Dickens character Sarah Gamp, who was more interested in drinking gin than looking after her patients, was only really a mild exaggeration. Hospitals were places of last resort, where the floors were laid with straw to soak up blood. Florence transformed nursing when she got back from Crimea. She had access to people in high places, and she used it to get things done. She was stubborn, opinionated, and forthright, but she had to be all those things in order to achieve what she did. According to another 2008 biography, Nightingale was merely against contagionism, a forerunner of germ theory. Despite the fact that she is sometimes accused of rejecting the theory of infection throughout her life. According to this theory, diseases could only be spread through physical contact. Few people took germ theory seriously prior to Pasteur and Lister's experiments in the middle of the 1860s, and many medical professionals remained skeptical even afterward. It took a little while for the ideas to catch on, especially when the old established means are so firmly entrenched. It's noted that Nightingale wrote a textbook article in the 1880s promoting stringent measures that were intended to eradicate germs. Nurses during the American Civil War were inspired by Nightingale's work. She was asked to advise the Union government on field medicine, and that's a big thing. If anyone knows about the Civil War medical processes, well, you'd know they were certainly needed to have some outside help. A lot of people having those amputations, oof. You've seen the videos, they're not good. The United States Sanitary Commission, a volunteer organization, was also inspired by her ideas, and they did all they could. According to Nightingale herself, her new style of matrons had complete authority and discipline over their nursing staff, and she promoted autonomous nursing leadership. Doctors occasionally felt that these new-style Nightingale matrons were undermining their authority, as demonstrated by the notorious Guy's Hospital dispute that took place between matron Margaret Burt and hospital medical staff in 1879 to 80. There were similar problems, especially between Ava Lux and other matrons, so this was an isolated incident. But it's one of those things where people don't like to be usurped from their roles of authority. And of course, doctors, believing that there is this hierarchy, will not be superseded by someone who they believe is lower down the rung. Now, America's first trained nurse, Linda Richards, was mentioned by Nightingale in the 1870s, and she was able to return to the U.S. with the necessary education and experience to start prestigious nursing schools. In the U.S. and Japan, Richards became a pioneer in nursing. According to the Nightingale Plan, Elizabeth Christophers Hobson co-founded the Bellevue Training School for Nurses in New York in 1873, which established the standard for nursing in the United States from then on. Back in London, St. Mary's Hospital, Westminster Hospital, St. Marylebone Workhouse Infirmary, and the Hospital for Incurables in Putney. Throughout Britain, the Royal Victoria Hospital, Netley Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, Cumberland and Liverpool Royal Infirmary, and in Sydney, Australia, that is being in New South Wales, a number of Nightingale nurses had advanced to the rank of matrons by 1882. And in 1883, Florence Nightingale received the Royal Red Cross for the first time. She received the title Lady of Grace of the Order of St. John in 1904. She was the first female of the Order of recipient of the Order of Merit in 1907. She also received the Honorary Freedom of the City of London in the following year. Internationally, May 12th, Awareness Day, is now observed on her birthday. Now, of course, before this, Nightingale had experienced intermittent bed rest and depression starting in 1857, according to a recent biography that causes brucellosis and spondylitis. The majority of modern authorities acknowledge that Nightingale had a particularly severe case of brucellosis, the symptoms of which didn't really subside until the early 1880s, so quite a long time to suffer with that. She continued to be incredibly productive, however, in her social reform despite her symptoms. She also made groundbreaking contributions to hospital planning while she was bedridden, and her work swiftly spread through Britain and the rest of the world. She was able to choose and buy flannel from the comfort of her own home through mail order, a brand new retail strategy developed by Welsh businessman Price Jones, who would often use Nightingale's name as a client in his advertisements. I think a businessman with the name Price is quite funny. Moving on. During her final 10 years, Nightingale's output, of course, significantly decreased. Due to her blindness and deteriorating mental faculties, she wrote very little during that time. But she did continue to be interested in current events and put her 2 cents in when she could. Nightingale had felt that women were somewhat less capable than men and yearned for sympathy despite the fact that a large portion of her work improved the lot of women everywhere. She criticized early women's rights for complaining about a purported lack of career opportunities for women, while high-paying jobs, overseen by Nightingale and others, remained unfulfilled for years. She frequently referred to herself as, for instance, a man of action and a man of business. She preferred the friendship of powerful male companions, claiming they had done more to help women achieve their goals, writing, "I have never found one woman who has altered her life by 1 iota for me or my opinions." She did, however, have a number of significant and enduring friendships with women. She worked in Crimea with the Irish nun Mary Clare Moore, who she maintained a long correspondence with in later life. Also Mary Clark, that English woman she met in Paris, they also remained in contact, and was her most cherished confidant, despite the age difference. According to Nightingale, I quote, "They said she could not possibly have lived so long, were it not for the tremendous vitality of the brain that would not die," after Ada Lovelace, a pioneering programmer actually, died of cancer at the age of 36 in 1852, after suffering from a disease for several months. Perhaps because she felt a religious calling to her work, some Nightingale scholars maintain that she would have been chaste throughout her life, but there's no real way to prove that. At the age of 90, she passed away, quietly in her sleep on August 13, 1910, in her room in Mayfair, London, number 10, South Street. She is buried in the churchyard of St. Margaret's Church in East Wellow, Hampshire, close to Embley Park, with a memorial that has her initials and the dates of her birth and death. Very simple. Her family turned down the offer of burial in Westminster Abbey, which would have been a great honor, but probably not something that Florence would have wanted. Among her many works she left behind were several hundred previously unpublished notes. In 1913, Francis William Sargent erected a monument to Florence Nightingale in the cloister of the Basilica of San Croce in Florence, Italy, using Carrara marble. Now, before we go a little bit more about some personal things, some little asides that don't quite come at the start of the video, but rather at the end, the bonus you get for listening this long. From a young age, she had demonstrated a talent for mathematics, and she flourished in the subject while learning from her father. She went on to become a pioneer in statistical graphics and information visualization. She employed techniques like the pie chart, which was initially created in 1801 by William Playfair. It was a relatively new way of presenting data at the time, but it's now pretty common. In fact, Nightingale is referred to as a true pioneer in the graphical representation of statistics, and is particularly well known for using a polar area diagram, or sometimes the Nightingale Rose diagram, to show the seasonal sources of patient mortality in the military field hospital she oversaw. This diagram is comparable to the contemporary circular histogram. Now, although he is usually given credit for creating the polar area diagram, André Michel Guéry was the first to use it in 1829, and by 1830, Léon Louis Lelaine had adopted it. The term coxcomb was coined by Nightingale to describe a collection of these diagrams. It would later be widely applied to the individual diagrams, since members of Parliament and civil servants would not have been likely to read or comprehend traditional statistical reports. She used coxcombs extensively to present reports on the scope and nature of medical care during the Crimean War. She also became the first woman elected to the Royal Statistical Society in 1859, and received an honorary membership in the American Statistical Association in 1874. She focused on the British Army's health in India, and showed that the high death rate was caused by poor ventilation, overcrowding, contaminated water, and poor drainage. Nightingale came to the conclusion that the Army's and the Indian people's poor health were intertwined after reading the report of the Royal Commission on India in 1863, which featured illustrations by her cousin, Hilary Bonham Carter, with whom she had lived at the time. As a result, Nightingale launched an effort to improve the nation's overall hygienic conditions. In addition to conducting a thorough statistical analysis of rural sanitation in India, Nightingale played a role in the country's transition to better public health and medical care, and she was successful in her efforts to have a royal commission established to look into the situation in 1858. She gave the Commission a report 2 years later, and in 1863, the Commission had finished its own investigation. I quote, "After 10 years of sanitary reform, in 1873, Nightingale reports that mortality among the soldiers in India had declined from 69 to 18 per 1,000 rather. She also had the chance to advocate for mandatory sanitation in private homes during the Royal Sanitary Commission of 1868 to 69. She persuaded James Stansfield, the relevant minister, to make the proposed public health bill stronger and mandate that existing property owners pay for the connection to mains drainage. The Public Health Acts of 1874 and 75 put these strengthened laws into effect. She also worked with Edwin Chadwick, a retired sanitary reformer, to convince Stansfield to remove the medical technocrats' central control and give local authorities more power to enforce laws. Given the state of knowledge at the time, she was persuaded by the statistics from the Crimean War that non-medical methods were more successful. Between 1871 and the mid-1930s, when medical science had pretty much no effect on deadly epidemic diseases, the average national life expectancy increased by 20 years, thanks in part to drainage and devolved enforcement. While Nightingale's own infrequent allusions to traditional Unitarianism are somewhat disparaging, even though she is identified as a Unitarian in a number of earlier writings and sources. Despite her unconventional beliefs, she spent her entire life with the Church of England. She was influenced by the Wesleyan tradition from a young age, believing that the true religion should be demonstrated via compassionate care and love for others. Fair enough. Sounds pretty reasonable. She developed her heterodox ideas in her theological work, Suggestions for Thought, which is her own theodicy. She believed in universal reconciliation, which holds that even those who pass away without being saved will eventually enter heaven, and she questioned the goodness of a God who would send souls to hell. On occasion, she would use this perspective to reassure the people who were under her care, which is certainly a good skill for a nurse to have. For instance, Nightingale used the phrase, "Pray God that you might never be in despair. I am at this time," to a dying young night walker who was receiving care because she was afraid she was going to hell. The nurse responded, "Oh, my girl, are you not now more merciful than the God you think you are going to? Yet the real God is far more merciful than any human creature ever was or can ever imagine." For a large portion of her life, Nightingale believed that both pagan and Eastern religions had authentic revelation, despite her strong personal devotion to Christ. She was an outspoken opponent of prejudice against non-Christians, as well as Christians of various denominations. She would make sure that the nurses under her supervision attended regular religious services because she felt that religion gave people strength to perform the difficult but honorable work. She did, however, frequently criticize religion too. She disapproved of the part of the Church of England playing in escalating the oppression of the poor in the 19th century. Secular hospitals, according to her, typically offered superior care compared to their religious counterparts. Although she believed that the ideal health professional should be driven by both professional and religious motivations, she also claimed that in reality, many religiously motivated healthcare professionals were more focused on ensuring their own salvation rather than providing the best care possible. I'm sure that those opinions would have been quite controversial back in the day. Well, with that, we get to the end of our little video on Florence Nightingale. I hope you liked it, and I certainly am glad for our current situation in terms of medicine. Of course, we're going to look back in 100 years and say that things that we have done are very barbaric. In 2125, we'll be looking at 2025 medicine thinking, how could we have possibly thought that was appropriate behavior? But right now, we just don't have the foresight. Let's see how the next generation look back on us. Please don't be too judgmental, anyone who's listening. Well, I will thank the top-tier patrons: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Amber, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfit, Nia, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, the HMS, HH, Crystal, and Talvery. Thank you very much. And thank you, honored listener. I will see you in the next video, where we will learn even more. Good night. Lots of love to you all.